special occasion to have the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank here on home stage for the president of the bank, but home city for both of them. Both of them, two strong leaders. So I thought about it, you both break the mold. What do we have with President Kim? We've got a doctor, of all things. We've got an anthropologist. But he's been interested in development for his whole career and has all kinds of experience and prestige in that area. I don't think of Dartmouth as a development institution, Mr. President, but they rather think it's well developed, and they certainly don't think it's poverty-stricken, I don't think. But it's another example of your leadership, and we're delighted to have your hospitality and have you here. And then the managing director of the fund, Christine Lagarde, she's a Parisian, which is not all that unusual in the World Bank, but very unusual that this young Parisian became manager of one of the leading law firms in the United States. How often does that happen? But I guess that was considered to pass a certain test. If you could lead an American law firm, maybe you had the qualities to be in the French cabinet. And she was in the French cabinet, became the finance minister. Another breakthrough for the feminine side of the divide here, and now also breaking the mold in the IMF as a lawyer, not as a Frenchman, but as a lawyer, as a woman. We shouldn't have to mention that these days, but I will nonetheless mention it because it is breaking through. And as certainly someone very familiar with this country. So, Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
We've been around here for 40 years with the Bretton Woods Institution. What do you got to say for yourself?
Well, welcome back, and it's great to have you back. It's great to see everyone again. There's some really interesting things happening in the world. You know, as an anthropology graduate student, I used to read 680-page books all the time. But now, a 680-page book on capitalism in the 21st century is a #1 selling book on Amazon. And I can't tell you. I wonder how many people who bought that book on Amazon actually read the whole thing. But how interesting that that is part of the conversation. And I have to say, I think part of the interest in inequality is frankly due to Christine's leadership, and she's really put this on the agenda for the IMF and has begun to ask questions. And so I think that the questions that he raises, Thomas Piketty in that book, are ones that are central to many discussions now that are happening. Oxfam talked about 85 richest people in the world controlling as much resources as the bottom half of the world's population. There is, at the World Economic Forum, there were just so many sessions on inequality. And so I think, fundamentally at the World Bank, we're focused on, of course, promoting economic growth, especially in the low and middle income countries. But I think there's a new part of that conversation, which is, how can we play our own role in boosting economic growth, but an economic growth that's shared, that's more inclusive, and also an economic growth that pays attention to powerful forces like climate change. So in some senses, our job is pretty straightforward. Boosting economic growth that's inclusive, and that is going to help us preserve the planet for future generations. Now, in the middle of all that, we have a lot of very specific questions to answer. Piketty doesn't really take up this issue, but there's one paragraph in his book which is very interesting, and he says that there really only have been two major forces that he thinks have reliably moved the world toward convergence, and that is the diffusion of knowledge and the investment in people, in their skills and their productivity. And so if that's the case, one of the questions that we are asking ourselves now is, what do we know from all of the work that we've been doing over 70 years about ways of doing development that will lead to both growth and convergence, which is his word. In other words, are there ways of building roads and dams and putting in energy supplies, ways of investing in health, education, and social protection that will lead the world toward both growth and convergence as opposed to growth that's not inclusive? And these are very practical questions. And we hope that, especially by the annual meetings in the fall, we hope that we'll come up with a compelling picture of what we've learned over 70 years in pushing the world in just that direction.
Well, thank you. Madam Managing Director, floor is yours.
Oh, bonjour. First of all, if I may, I would like to say thank you to the Bretton Woods Committee. And I really mean that seriously. You've heard about the quota reform, you've heard about the embarrassment, but I want to thank you, each of you individually, for having pushed that issue, for having signed the letter, for having every step of the way tried to help the completion of the reform that is so important to make sure that the fund is relevant and is relevant to its membership. So thank you. That's the first thing I wanted to do. Now, I thought about sort of something intelligent I could tell you, and you know so many things, and you have so much wisdom amongst yourselves. And I thought I would reflect a little bit on my 3 years. I've been at the helm of the IMF for 3 years, and what characterizes what I have seen in those 3 years. And I came up with the word adapt. You know, we are essentially, as I look at it, in 3 lines of business, to use corporate analogies, which maybe is not appropriate, but never mind. We are in the business of lending, we are in the business of surveillance, and we are in the business of technical assistance. And I think over the course of the biggest financial crisis that we've seen in decades, the fund has been able to adjust and to adapt in all 3 business lines. In lending, we have been under huge pressure to lend in the aftermath of what was a downsizing of the fund. You know, beginning of 2008, my predecessor was asked to reduce the size of the fund, to slim it down. And we had to cope with massive demand on the institution. We lend something in the range of $700 billion during that period of time. No areas on those, by the way. And we had to adapt. We had to come up with the flexible credit line. We had to come up with the precautionary and liquidity lines. We had to come up with special initiatives for the low-income countries with the use of the Poverty and Reduction Growth Trust. And the IMF was able to just adapt to those new demands under those new circumstances. Now, in the field of surveillance, one big ticket item that was identified is the degree of interconnectedness between the countries and between the economy, and how much the financial linkages between them was an accelerator of anything that went by, whether it was crisis or happy developments. We haven't seen much of the latter, by the way. So in the field of surveillance, we soon found out that the bilateral surveillance under the traditional Article 4 was not just going to cut it, and that we had to go beyond that and do multilateral surveillance, focus on some clusters, really identify the role played by the financial circuits, the circuit breakers, the role of supervision in stability, which is still obviously the core mandate of the fund. And then in the third area of business, which is technical assistance, which is not really well known. We have had so much development, it's just hard to believe. We currently have technical assistance mission with 150 members out of the 188 members. 150 members. So it's not as if we were doing a few ad hoc mission in some remote parts of Africa. No, we do technical assistance in all corners of the world. And I would add that, as part of the adapt process that we've gone through, we've also taken into account what, I was going to say Dr. Kim, but it's Jim for me, and I'm Christine for him. That's how we operate. But what he has alluded to, we have to take into account some of the long-term perspectives, such as the role of climate change and how it impacts not only the environment, but the fiscal resources and the use of fiscal resources by any of our members. In the same vein, we had to look at how rising inequality impacts on the stability and the sustainability of growth. And we have to look, when we look at growth, at what is likely to create jobs rather than improves productivity without having any regard for jobs. So some would argue that those long-term issues, long-term trends and uncertainties, as I call them, are not exactly core business for the fund. And I strongly disagree with that. And I think it has been part of our adaptation process by which we look at what's on the horizon and we try to figure out what in the short term will be helpful, needed, desirable, or at least can be laid out for those who make decisions today that will impact tomorrow. Voilà.
Well, thank you both. I want to raise a general question for both of you, and I'll have a specific question or two, but you make a very strong case for the activities of the fund once Europe got in big trouble. And they didn't want you around when they first got in trouble, but as the trouble was extended and deepened, World Bank, the IMF was called upon to participate in lending, in surveillance, and technical assistance, full speed, all the way. And I think it's been obviously a constructive and a felt need at that particular point in time. Now, the obvious question that arises from there is, where were you before the crisis? And
in Europe.
I could say the same thing about the bank, but I heard enough of the discussion this morning to know that there's a preoccupation. You know that there's a preoccupation with, on the one side, the world is getting closer and closer. The markets are open. It's very international. It's interconnected. All that is going on at the same time, looking at it from a political direction in this country, but I think elsewhere, a weaker sense of commitment to the bank and the fund, or more broadly, a weaker sense of commitment to any kind of cooperation internationally. Now, how do you respond to that in your very difficult positions where, sure, things get bad enough, in desperation they call upon you, but we hope we're not always in crisis, and how do we avoid the crisis, and how do we deal with this kind of standoffish attitude toward international cooperation that was the foundation of the Bretton Woods system 70 years ago?
You know, I'm happy to take that question because I was amongst those around the European table, mandated by my government at the time, to resist the IMF coming in. Jean-Claude Trichet was one of those as well. And as you said, we eventually were resigned to welcoming the IMF because, number one, the situation was becoming extremely complicated and had ramification and contagion effects that were unexpected and unanticipated in the first place. And because the volume of, more than actually the volume of financial support, but the independence and the third party's approach in an unbiased way by the IMF was regarded as critically important to induce the key members to actually put money where their mouth was and actually finance, by a margin of about 65 to sometimes 80%, the programs that were put in place in the Eurozone, which were by far and away the massive use of the IMF funding at that time. So you are right that the IMF was not particularly welcome to begin with, and yet the necessity of cooperation, I believe, was demonstrated in what we invented on the fly. You know, the troika functioning, the way in which we cooperated with the European Central Bank and the European Commission in order to design the programs, in order to do the review, was completely novel. And that's also where I say that we have adapted. It was not the usual way of doing business for the IMF. You know, to sit at the table with the central bank on your side and part of the reviewers, to cooperate in a manner where we were in the game by a margin of 30%, a bit less with Cyprus. That was different as well, and we had to adjust. But I think the independent pair of eyes that we brought to each of those crises was deemed helpful by the members. And you know, having been on both sides of this equation, I'm certain that it was helpful, and that some of the measures that were eventually taken by way of economic structural reforms, but also by a fiscal path that was both rigorous and yet sensible, would probably not have happened in the same way or at the same speed had it not been for the IMF being around.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that in terms of the crisis, and I'll translate that back to my own experience in the 1980s with the Latin American debt crisis, where suddenly the IMF became very important, Jacques de la Rosière, and there was a lot of cooperation with the United States government in particular. But the question that keeps recurring is, yeah, okay, the firing comes out when the fire, but how do we permit the fires to get to that degree in the first place? And it seems to be more difficult now when there is a apparent reluctance to even support the kind of structural changes in management that are on the table right now. Well, the World Bank takes a long-term view, so why don't you get us out of this?
Well, you know, if you look back at the recent history of the bank, let's just take, you know, my predecessor, Bob Zellick. You know, when Bob came in 2007, the bank was in a bit of a what's the right word? There was a bit of unsteadiness here at the bank, and so Bob came in and did so much to steady the waters. And then the financial crisis hit, and then we played the expected and I think role very effectively. We were the countercyclical force. The lending rates went way up. We had a capital increase, and there's no question that from 2008 or so up until he left in 2012, really the focus was on just what you said. You know, the fire brigade, getting the money out the door, and the bank did a great job. And as I was walking in, this is exactly the question that I was asked, that you're asking. What's the role of the bank in the future? You know, even countries in Africa can get money from China or many other sources. And, you know, there are countries in Nigeria that are hiring McKinsey for their knowledge. So what really is your role? So I actually began asking that question inside the house, and I walked throughout the building. I visited every single unit here. I visited country offices, and I asked them some pretty simple questions. When have you been most proud of the World Bank? When has the bank been at its best? And what does it take? What will it take to get us there? And then we did these surveys and found that there was a tremendous amount of desire for change inside the house. Now, you know, there hadn't been a real structural change since 1997, and as I pointed out, it would have been crazy to try to do that during the financial crisis. But in 2012, it was the right time to sit down and ask this question. And so the conclusions we came up with were, one, that if knowledge was going to be as important as we all thought it was going to be, and again, it goes back to Piketty's notion that, that the diffusion of knowledge has been an incredibly important force to decrease inequality between and within countries. And so if knowledge was going to be that important, we all agreed. And you know, as we got into the change, there has been a lot more pushback. But at first, we agreed that the structures had become such that we were operating almost as 6 regional banks. We asked a pretty simple question. How much of your time, if you're a technical expert in one region, how much of your time do you spend providing technical support to other regions? And it was less than 1% of their time. And so effectively, if there was a great innovation on road building for example, the toll road that we built in Senegal that's had such a positive impact, the chances of that diffusing to Latin America were really by chance. In other words, if there was some kind of personal connection, they might have talked about it, but there was no system to really make it work. And what had happened is that the original matrix structure that we had built turned into a double matrix structure. In other words, the regions had their own technical experts, and at times, because the transaction costs were so high, they would rather go out and get an external consultant than rely on the technical groups inside the World Bank Group. So, you know, we decided, and again, let me just make this point. It sounds sometimes in the press like we're doing some kind of exotic change process. This is just fundamental management 101. Double matrices don't work. They don't take the full advantage of all the knowledge inside the house. So we essentially built a single matrix. But that's hard. It's a change in a bureaucratic organization that doesn't like it. The other thing we did was we started an actual budgeting process, and I got this idea from Christine. Christine had set up a rule that said that during the budget talks, you could talk about everyone's budget except your own. And she told me that on one of the first days I was there. And so then I began asking questions. So when do we have that discussion? Turned out we really didn't ever have that discussion. And the budgeting, now that we were out of the crisis period, was basically what you got last year plus cost of living. So I asked my public sector expenditure specialists, what would you say to a country that did budgeting like that? And so we decided that we were actually going to do a budgeting process, and we used that rule. You can talk about everyone else's budget but your own, and then we're gonna really vote on where we should put our priorities. And you know, people told me that except during crises for 30 years, that this is the first time that had been done. Now, the other thing we did was we did not detect any decrease in interest. What the countries told us was, if in fact you're going to be able to bring us innovations and ideas from all over the world, and you're going to help us with the structuring of the projects, with the evaluation, then we want to borrow more. So we actually were able to increase our ability to lend in IBRD by double. And we did this just with increasing our fees and also just using our balance sheet more effectively. Our equity loan ratio is 28%. And having a little more flexibility, we're able to double our IBRD lending. So the change for us has been, one, we're actually going to look at our budget, and we're doing an expenditure review. We're going to reduce the budget by $400 million in real terms. And this is just by asking fundamental questions like, why does it cost us 3 times more to do it here, the same thing, than it costs us to do it over there? Sometimes there are good explanations because the countries are different, the situations are different. Sometimes there's no explanation at all. And so this is just basic knowing where you're spending your money and actually then making choices. Do we really need all of these things here, whereas we want to actually invest more in client-facing opportunities? But that conversation wasn't happening. We're having it now. So at the end of the day, here's where I think we'll come out. One, we have more capacity to lend, which is great, and we were able to do it without a capital increase. Two, the new global practices, their job is going to be to find all the greatest and most potentially effective innovations in health, education, transport, trade, and then be sure that throughout all of the regions, if a country is interested in tackling that problem, we give them global knowledge that is the best in the world, and focus not on telling them what to do, but what to do, and then working with them and helping them with the how, because that's often the most difficult part. It's the implementation and delivery that's the most difficult. If we can do that, then I think we will continue to be relevant, because then we will be the go-to organization for both lending, and then at this point, usually free technical assistance that will bring to them everything that's happening in the world that might be of relevance. And that's the organization that I thought that the whole house was telling me we needed. But then, of course, when we actually got into making the changes, it became difficult.
You say, if you can do that. I don't know much, but I know the toughest job in the world is reforming an international bureaucracy. You wanted to add a word.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing, because I agree with Jim that making sure that knowledge is shared is critically important. at the fund, there is another area where I believe that we have to do more work, and we have begun, but we have to do more. You ask, why did we not spot what was happening, what was, you know, sort of burning under the surface and eventually erupted in 2007 or 2008, depending on where you think the trigger started. And that's an obsession, in a way. And it was actually identified by our chief economist. But nobody really paid attention. Raghu actually, you know, published a paper, but it wasn't perceived as critically important. And in my view, it has partly to do with the culture of our institution. The culture of the fund is to be risk adverse. And when you are overly risk adverse, you don't tolerate lateral thinking. You don't tolerate out-of-the-box ideas. And as a result of that, maybe you are not able to spot risks.
The rest of the world wasn't listening either.
That's true. That is true. But I think that, you know, to be better risk spotters, we need to be a little bit less risk adverse. And to be less risk adverse, we need to understand how risk is managed. And that's a culture that we are working on, and where there will be a few changes coming up, so that the staff, knowing that risk is actually managed and is on the radar screen of management and the board, then they can feel more comfortable thinking a bit outside the box, having a bit of lateral thinking, and not being hostile to those who hold a view that is different.
Huge issue for us as well. It's a huge issue for us. And for us, it's on a smaller scale. I mean, we would, the organization, again, one of the critiques that came through all the organizational health surveys was that we had become incredibly risk averse as well. And it's that very issue. What we were doing is that layer upon layer upon layer of bureaucracy was being built up. Decision making was being kicked up the ladder higher and higher and higher. And thinking that that would protect them from being held responsible if something bad happened. But again, it's entirely the approach of being able to be proactive on risk management. We're now really working on changing the culture and helping our own folks understand risk management, because the most transformational potential projects are going to be risky. There's no question about it.
I got an easy question for each of you, different question that preoccupied me. A little background for the first question. I established in my, how should I describe my condition? I wish I was 80 again, but I'm a little beyond that. I established a little institute to try to improve the organization of the U.S. government and other governments. You've been talking about organizational problems and the importance of getting things done and all the rest. And when I met with my first board of directors for this little institute, they said, look, Paul, the most important problem in the world, not just in the United States, in growth and in governance, is corruption. And so we had a little discussion, and some other wise director said, that's the most important problem in the world, Paul, but it's a little big for you to take on. I don't think you should do it. So my only response to that, it may be too big for me, but it can't be too big for the World Bank. The World Bank is in a critical position here. If corruption is a cancer on development, as Jim Wolfson said, and it's more than that, we got corruption all over the world. We got, a lot of it's legal in the United States, but that's a different story. It is a big problem, and I sense is that it's a growing problem, and I think the World Bank uniquely in the other development institutions, but the World Bank can lead because it's dealing with emerging countries and poor countries, many of which have a big problem in corruption, and you have a certain amount of leverage. How's it going?
Well, you know, we're pretty clear about this. I mean, I think the story from 1996, it's amazing how much things have changed. And, you know, Paul, you've played a huge role in pushing this along. But when Jim, in 1996, at an annual meeting, at the annual meeting, wanted to talk about corruption, everyone in his organization told him not to. You can't possibly do that. You can't even say the C word. And he tells a great story. One leader that he went to visit soon after his Cancer of Corruption speech said to him, and if you probably heard this, he said, what you call corruption, we call family values. Right? and so, Jim uttered the word, and then we've been working on it ever since, as you know, Paul. And we have a whole integrity team that's been growing over time. And one of the things that we're now having to ask ourselves is, are we still going after the right things? Are we looking in the right areas? Certainly fraud, if they're stealing, often we're picking up a lot of cheating on CVs, right? And so we're now asking ourselves, are there much bigger issues ongoing that may sort of require us to be much better at forensic accounting, for example? I mean, are there different ways that we now need to look for corruption? And that's one of the discussions we're having. So absolutely committed to being intolerant of corruption. But one of the conversations that we're having right now with Leonard and the whole team is, do we need to broaden our approach so that we can find the kinds of corruption that really do matter, right? If a few CVs have been embellished, do we pat ourselves in the back and say we caught corruption, or do we then go back and say, but wait a minute, that might have happened in a good company? What is the real issue that we're trying to solve with this problem? And I think it's partly because this is new. I mean, this is only about 10 years old, and we're gonna keep going and try to get less than 10 years old, frankly. And we're gonna continue to try to get better so that we're actually solving the problem that corruption poses. And I think at first we may have been we may have been going down certain paths more, and now we're going to broaden our approach.
Well, it's a tough challenge, and I think the World Bank's come some distance, and I know that people don't like to talk about corruption when you're criticizing their programs and whether they've really been implemented correctly. So you got to keep after it, in my opinion.
We will.
Let me get to the monetary system. You're supposed to have something to do with that, I think, some surveillance. I was struck, as I'm sure many people were struck, just about a year ago, when Ben Bernanke had a press conference talking about the lesson. Maybe he should have fewer press conferences, but he talked for some length about the plans for monetary policy in the United States, and the market kind of went bananas, and interest rates rose, and there were all kinds of complaints from some developing countries that the United States was taking action without consulting them and what was going on here. So I thought I'd go back and read what Mr. Bernanke actually said, and near as I could say, he didn't say a thing that was different than what he'd been saying for months. He might have been saying it because the press, do you exactly mean that, Mr. Bernanke? And he would say the same thing in slightly different words. Why do people get upset? And then they've taken some moves, which, good or bad, I think he's certainly in the right direction, but you can't take a much milder monetary policy move than what they've been doing in recent months while repeating the same mantra. But yet, the argument seems to be that somehow the Open Market Committee should have a consultation with Brazil and India before each meeting to see whether somehow it seemed to be all out of proportion. But there is a reality here that if the United States made a big move, obviously it affects the rest of the world. So what does that say about international monetary arrangements when monetary policy is still run by central banks that like to think of themselves as independent and taking care of their own national needs? But what's that say about the system? What's it say about the role of the IMF, if anything?
It's the whole story for us of what we call the spillovers and the spillbacks. And I'll explain that I'll try to make it simple. What I said when I responded to your first question, Paul, was that clearly what came out of the crisis is the unbelievable both intricacy and significant role played by the financial interconnections. That came out clearly. What we observed during the crisis is that the monetary policies in many corners, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, took the bulk of the burden of dealing with the, say, post-crisis key effects. And they have gone in the main out of their traditional way to try to cope with the issues faced by the economies over which they have authority in as independent a way as possible. And I completely agree with your assessment of how independent they should be. So if you take all these factors into account, having gone out of their way, clearly what they do is even more acutely observed than it was ever before, which is why, you know, the little thing, if any, that President Bernanke said had ripple effects. And back in May 2013, hang on, 13, yeah, that was a year ago now, suddenly there were those volatility movements observed around the world, and there was capital flow out of these emerging markets where there had been capital flow into in previous months, simply because of the prospect that long-term interest rates would probably rise. And that's what we call the spillover effects, and that we have observed, we are analyzing as much as we can. Now, clearly, when we say to the central bankers who are making the decisions of gradual tapering, of slightly moving away from the untraditional monetary policies that they've ventured into, or giving a bit of forward guidance and venturing into that field, when we say to them, be careful because clearly what you're doing is having effect in Brazil, in Mexico, in South Africa, in India, and elsewhere, they say naturally, none of our business. Our mandate is domestic. We have to look at what happens at home. Of course, the emerging market economies are not particularly happy about it because they see the ripple effects that those decisions have. So further than that, I think two sort of trends have emerged. One is I believe that key central bankers have agreed amongst themselves to continue to cooperate, to collaborate. I'm not using the word coordinate, bear with me, with their colleagues from the emerging market economies so that they understand what is happening. And why is that? Because of this second trend that we are trying to analyze and identify as well, which is what we call the spill back. In other words, if because of the spillovers, there is volatility, there is clear movement of both currency and interest rates in those emerging markets and low-income countries eventually that are affected, then that might very well have a consequential and unintended direct effect into the domestic base where the initial monetary decision was made. And as a result of the spillback, then it becomes part and parcel of the thinking of the central bank must have in respect of its own domestic economy. So that's an area where we're trying to measure, to analyze, to identify, to help, and which has led us to probably revisit a bit our position on the use of international reserve. We're not changing our view on the floating exchange rate that we continue to recommend, but that's where we are. So we encourage this cooperation/collaboration. We try to analyze not only the spillover, but also the spillbacks to give an incentive to those that are prepared to pay attention to what's happening elsewhere to explain why they make such decisions. And we also say international reserves, okay, that's our view.
You weren't really ever been tempted to think about the Tobin tax and all those short-term capital movements, have you? You don't have to answer that question. I think we come to the time when the audience out there may have a question or two. Well, I guess you're supposed to line up. Is that the protocol behind the microphone?
I got the first ticket, I guess. Chairman Volcker.
You're going to be succinct and direct.
I'm going to be very succinct.
And provocative.
I'm Robert Albertson from Sandler O'Neill. Mohammed unleashed an elephant in the room, which I think almost you could answer the question better than your distinguished panelists, but all three of you, I don't care. Monetary experimentation is, or has to ultimately come to an end, I think is the way he phrased it. And most of us have no clue or great fear of how and what happens. Can you shed any light on what you think will happen?
No.
No.
I'm the moderator here. Not the but it's interesting. That's what Bernanke in effect, said a year ago. He said, you know, someday this is going to happen, and we're going to worry about inflation, and interest rates will go up, and all bananas took place.
But they're clearly experimenting and have experimented, thank goodness, because of the necessity to step in and for somebody to step in and to give enough reassurance. But having stepped in, they're going to have to step out. And what we're seeing, I think there will be asymmetry in that movement, and those that stepped in first will probably step out first as well. That's, you know, in terms of sequence, which is not shedding much light on your question. Hopefully they will do that gradually so that we don't have the big hiccups of, say, the 1994 events. Hopefully they will communicate it sufficiently clearly so that markets, where Mohammed is clearly far more knowledgeable than I am, will have a say. But at least they can perceive, understand, and analyze as well clearly what is anticipated. The thinking of our research department is that reasonably low interests are probably with us for the long term. And how will, in all that, inflation behave will be very interesting to watch as well, given the output gap that we have. So I've not given you any clear answer, but, you know...
That makes you a good central banker. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for your candid insights and for the committee. I'm Luis San Vicente from Montclair State, professor of economics. My question concerns the general public, and that is in the field of fiscal policy, monetary policy, environmental policy, trade policy that we have discussed. Now we're sort of in the branches of antagonic sentiments towards, say, the Troika. And my challenge, at least in the classroom, it's sometimes easy because I have time to discuss and go in depth, is the general public. How can the World Bank and IMF communicate better? What are these counterfactual things that if you hadn't done it, or what are these dispersed gains from trade that we could communicate a little better? Talking about the Piketty book, basically it was in your face, the data on inequality. That's why it got such a momentum. But all these other things are rather more invisible. Right. Thank you.
Let me just start quickly. One of the things, I actually called Thomas and asked him specifically about, and it's really just almost one little paragraph. Because what I said was, well, you know, as we're waiting for a global tax on wealth, and as we're waiting for, you know, large countries to put in, you know, other than France, to put a 75% tax on their elite. In the meantime, all right, are there specific things that we can do to actually help move the world toward convergence? I mean, you know, for example, we've been in the area of climate change, right? So we all know that fuel subsidies are awful. They're regressive, and they're a huge hit on the budget. They also worsen climate change. You know, these are things that's just one of many that could happen right now. So one of the things that we're going to try to do is to talk about the role of the World Bank in being a facilitator of convergence. In other words, if we can be facilitators of insights about how to take your educational system and leapfrog generations of bad practice from what we've learned from Rio de Janeiro has done that in their educational system. And if we can help people make better investments in healthcare, those are two direct investments in human capital that you don't have to wait and make all the mistakes that all the other countries have had. So one of the things we're trying to do is to really talk about ourselves as a force toward helping countries to grow in a way that does lead to greater inclusion and participation. Now that's a message we're still trying to craft, but I think that frankly both of our institutions, and you know, Christine talked about all the technical assistance, these things make a difference. If you can help people again leapfrog generations of mistakes and do better, I think people will understand at that level. The Troika, I will let Christine address that issue.
You know, I will actually follow up from your question, the response that you got from Jim on one particular point. We are often portrayed as advising the elimination of subsidies, particularly the fossil energy subsidies that eat up about, trillions of dollars, if you take the fiscal consequences thereof. instead of saying, remove the subsidies in our programs, what we're trying to say now is put in place a system that will provide the safety net for those that are most in need of those subsidies. Make sure that those 40% of the population that is below a certain threshold, and that needs to be decided at country level, have cash transfers, have available means to replace what fiscally and environmentally you should remove because it's hurting your economy and it's not doing any good for the planet. So I think it's reversing the factor. Instead of going gang-ho on remove the subsidies, we say, first of all, put in place a safety net, and then make the hard decision.
And we work together on that because we actually provide direct lending and support for those kinds of cash transfer programs that have blunted the impact of the removal of subsidies in lots of countries. Right?
Well, one more here, and then we'll go back there, and then we'll come back here, and that, I think, will take care of us. With succinct questions. Oh, another one over there. All right, well, make the questions a little bit shorter than I...
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you for your comments. I'm encouraged by both your comments on the internal efforts to make change at your institutions. So I have two quick questions. Just one on inequality. How do you ensure that inequality is a subject of your policy advice and practice and not just a subject of research and public statements? Second question. I'd like to hear from both of you how you think your successors should be selected.
We have to ask Mohammed.
What the questions we're asking right now are, I think I alluded to it earlier. Are there ways of actually building roads in a way that will lead to growth and inclusion as opposed to growth and exclusion? And what we're learning is that everything from the way you set up the original bids for procurement, including local contractors, for example, more small and medium enterprises, it turns out that there are lots of different ways to think about even something as straightforward as road building that could potentially lead to greater equality. And because for the World Bank, we have two goals, ending poverty by 2030 and boosting shared prosperity, this is a question we're going to ask over and over and over again. Now, of course, the countries are in the lead. But if we have evidence to suggest that doing it this way versus doing it that way will lead to both growth and inclusion, then we have to put that on the table. At the end of the day, the clients will decide. But we're now challenging ourselves to answer that question in everything that we do. We need to understand more clearly what the trade-off is, and if there is one, between inclusion and growth. But we want to be able to provide those strategies which are most amenable to both of those things. And my team tells me that in just about everything we do, we can find that path. And in terms of elections, well, the good thing is we have boards, and boards decide those things, and we will leave it to them.
On your first point, I don't know whether it was you or somebody else. On your first point, when we advise on fiscal policies as part of our programs, clearly focusing on keeping the spending and possibly expanding the spending on health and education are key elements to actually try to defeat the rising inequality, and that we do. And we now have documented the fact that those countries under program with the IMF have actually spent 20% more on education and 40% more on health than countries not under program. And we will continue to do that. Now, you have the whole gamut of tax prescriptions, whether it should be progressive, more so, more less, and all the rest of it. That's clearly also an area where we can give recommendation, advice, but it's for the government and the authorities of those countries to decide and determine how they go forward. But in terms of public spending, we can certainly include that and do include it in our programs. Succession, well, there's a board as well. I'll give you an example. We have a deputy managing director, Shafiq Nemat, who is a fantastic deputy managing director, so much so that she's been hired now to become the deputy governor of the Bank of England, unfortunately. So I need to replace Minouche, as much as I hate to have to do that. We're going to go through a completely transparent process using external candidates that will hopefully be enticed by the job description that will be published both in the Financial Times and The Economist. And that process will be 100% transparent. There will be no behind the door little deals cut in smoky rooms. No, transparent.
I look forward to that job description.
You'll be up for a surprise.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
You can date.
So say, hey, we're lining up more people. We're rushing. You got to stop. You're over here. You're next, and one here, and then I think we are finished.
Okay. My name is Zaharut Samuelian. I am the Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon. I know, Mr. Kim, I think you have a plan to visit the area, and probably you go to Lebanon. My question would be, in an environment where there are huge challenges and a lot of tasks that are coming up every day, probably you'll be seeing things that you haven't seen before. With the huge refugees coming into Lebanon, into the neighboring countries, and all the things, all the aid, all the help that they would need. Probably you would need so many new ideas and approaches to these problems. And one thing probably you should know, Lebanon enjoys a huge potential or has huge facilities or capabilities of human resources, connectivities, and efficiently operating banks that could help your mission. This is what I wanted you to know. What would be your priorities within this given circumstance?
Short answer.
Yeah, I look forward to going there. We're doing everything we can to support. You may know that we did a full assessment of the impact of the Syrian conflict on Lebanon this past summer. And these documents usually take us as long as a year, and we did it in 5 weeks because we thought it was so urgent. And the numbers were stunning in terms of the depth of the impact. Unfortunately, I don't have any bright ideas about how to transform the situation. We are at the very limits of everything we can do in terms of providing financial support. I'm going there mostly just to listen, and we're of course watching very carefully the elections that are happening in Syria, which will be very soon. If you have creative or ideas about what we might be able to do to be more effective, please let me know. We're standing, as you know, we're standing with the people of Lebanon. We're providing support. We continue to run our programs, but it's just a very difficult situation.
Very short question back there.
Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. I'll spare you, Madame Lagarde, a question about Ukraine or Greece or any other program, but rather ask a broader question. You're talking about the IMF adapting, and one of the things that has been proposed by emerging markets is a short-term liquidity facility. Can you help us understand why that's not going forward? Is that a legitimate moral hazard issue, or are there other reasons for that? And secondly, the pilot external sector report remains pilot after several years, and that's a key spillover report that you're talking about. Can you help me understand why it remains pilot, and will it continue to do so?
What is great with Jan is that he has the most pointed questions on the most up-to-date issues.
This is openness, transparency.
Yeah. No, I take it. I mean, I was so stoned by your second one. Yeah, the first one on the short-term liquidity facility. It's an issue that was debated at the spring meetings with the membership, and one where some central bankers have very clear view and appreciate that the fund can actually play a role. But as you know as well, the liquidity is often the realm of the central banks, and they do not necessarily welcome that anybody else, be it the fund, ventured in those areas. In addition to which, we have both the flexible credit line and the PLL, the precautionary and liquidity lines, which have been used by 3 countries for the first one, only 1 for the latter, and I was just back from Morocco, which has been a user of the PLL, which is extremely pleased with it. It doesn't even draw on the liquidity line. So we are, number one, assessing these two instruments, actually, as we speak, or later on this afternoon. The precautionary and liquidity line and the flexible credit line will be under review. And we continue a dialogue with authorities to see whether we need to improve upon those two instruments, market them better, or come up with something that would be clearly innovation and which would maybe draw on regional existing agencies and possibly banks as well. On your second point, the ESR, it is still pilot. I think it's in its second year actually. And you know, there are so many variables and so many iteration and so much work into this that I wouldn't be upset if it was a pilot for another year. But it's getting gradually, you know, more accurate and you know, very granular in terms of analysis.
We are like a soccer game. We have time for one overtime. But there haven't been any injuries or anything, so there's only one question, and you are the lucky winner.
Bonjour, Nicolas Montbriand, I'm the head of the Oxfam International Office in Washington. I mean, the first thing I want to say
When are you coming to see me?
Next week.
Oh, good.
No, it's 3 weeks. The first thing I want to say is on inequality. I just wanted to thank you both for raising it everywhere. You know, it's a central issue for us. I'm not going to ask a question on it because I think my colleague asked exactly the question I wanted to know, which is, what concretely are you going to do? The thing I wanted to ask in terms of question is linking up with the session before on the private sector and your views on what you think you two institutions can do to support the private sector in development. But I would say not any kind of private sector. I would say private sector that A, create jobs for people in countries, and B, a private sector that respects social and environmental standards. Thanks.
Well, this is a nice way to conclude, I
think. You know, we're in the midst of discussions around the so-called post-2015 agenda for the MDGs. And if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, it really was at first of all, there was no financing plan for the Millennium Development Goals until 2 years after the goals had been declared, which I think was really a problem because it ended up being about how to divide up official development assistance, foreign aid. And right now, if your aspirations for development are limited by the amount of foreign assistance that's available, then your aspirations turn out to be extremely low because it's about 130 billion ODA. And you know, Africa itself has 100 billion a year in needs in terms of infrastructure alone. And then if you add in the BRICS, that's about $1 trillion a year in infrastructure needs. So from our perspective, there's just no way that we're going to be able to achieve the goal of ending poverty, boosting shared prosperity, without a very strong role for the private sector. And I think we have to rethink it fundamentally. I think, you know, right now, what we're seeing is that there are lots of great projects that could provide both a strong return for investors and have a huge development impact. But because of the fear of investors on the one side in terms of, you know, perceived risk, and the inability to put all the pieces together to make the deal happen, there is this market failure, if you will. You know, capital on the sidelines and what we think are really bankable projects. So what we're trying to do is really bring our public and private sector groups together much, much more and ask ourselves, though, a fundamental question. As you may know, IFC, our private sector branch, has the IFC development goals. In other words, everything we do with the private sector, we ask ourselves the question, what's the development impact of these investments? Have people gotten access to healthcare? People gotten access to education? How many jobs were created? So we will continue to ask those questions. And the groups that work with us, what we hope is that they'll both get a very strong return on their investment and that we can play this role. At the G20, we've been talking a lot about something that we're calling the Global Infrastructure Facility, where the bank and the other multilateral development banks would be involved in trying to find ways of bringing the capital off the sideline with all of these great, what we think are bankable projects, and doing what we need to do to remove some of the risk, but also expose the opportunity for investors. And so it has to play a role. What the Secretary General has asked us to do is to put together a financing strategy ahead of the 2015 agenda that would say, you know, these are the things that really should be paid for with grant money. These are the things that you could do with loans. These are the things that the private sector, could be involved in. But another point is, these are things that countries should raise more domestic resources for, right? And if we have that kind of financing plan, I think the post-2015 agenda could be both much more inspiring and aspirational, but also much more realistic in terms of the financing.
A little bit to add.
I applaud wholeheartedly what Jim says. I think that the bank can play a major broker role in providing the assessment of the project and in providing the components of some sort of guarantee at some stage. I don't know. You know, I know it's in great hands, but it's critical. Just very quickly, in our fight against subsidies, we can help design public policies that actually are conducive to the right spending, that are environmentally friendly as opposed to totally unfriendly.
Let me thank both of you for taking time for what I am sure is a very pressing schedule to come and enlighten us and encourage us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you leaving?